Hello friends, I am glad to see you again. Today I'm going to tell you about a neighbor who thinks my house is a hotel. I've always been drawn to places with a little elbow room and a sense of peace, so when I got a chance to live near a river just outside the usual suburban sprawl, I jumped on it. My place isn't too large in terms of square footage, but its location is downright spectacular. A clear view of the water, with thick woods on the other side. The sunsets are unbelievably serene, with the sunlight dancing across the river in patterns that change by the minute. Even though there's a subdivision near my property, I was initially unaware of any organized homeowners association. My understanding was that the lot I purchased existed outside of their boundaries, mainly because the previous owner had subdivided the land in an unconventional way, leaving my house on an independent parcel. It was a bit unusual, but it worked out perfectly for me since I never liked the idea of an HOA breathing down my neck. After all, I've always enjoyed fixing or changing things on my own schedule without the constant worry of fees or citations. I never had any trouble with that arrangement, until a man I'll call Preston showed up and introduced himself as the new head of a neighborhood association I didn't even know existed in the first place. Preston appeared at my door one bright Saturday morning, not long after I moved in. I was on the porch with my coffee, watching a few ducks float down the water. At first, I assumed he was just another neighbor stopping by to say hello. He wore khakis, a polo shirt, and had that artificially friendly tone I've grown to recognize right away. He offered a hand to shake, introduced himself, and launched straight into his position as the newly elected boss of the local HOA. I remember him smiling with a sense of self-importance, rattling off all sorts of benefits and guidelines that I had to follow. But the entire conversation took a turn when I clarified that I wasn't part of that association. You'd think that would have been the end of it, but Preston insisted my property was in the region that his organization managed. I calmly explained how my land was divided based on the official county records, an arrangement the previous owner set up. I told him I'd double-check, but my deed made it clear I wasn't tied to any ongoing contracts. At first, he gave me an almost fatherly grin, as if I were a naive child who didn't understand the rules. Then, in a switch that was too quick to be polite, he almost demanded I hand over a copy of my deed for him to review. The request felt intrusive, but I tried to keep the peace. I said I'd look it over with an attorney if needed, but I wouldn't be handing out personal documents to a stranger. Preston didn't like that answer. He forced a tight-lipped smile, said something about how I'd come around eventually, and left. The following week, I discovered a letter in my mailbox bearing the HOA letterhead. It was a formal request for me to register my house with their association. The letter stated that since I was in the direct vicinity of the subdivision, I was responsible for certain fees: exterior maintenance fees, landscaping standards, and membership dues. It also listed that I must follow regulations such as the color of my house's exterior, the type of mailbox allowed, and even limitations on how tall my hedges could grow. I skimmed through the document, absolutely perplexed. None of this should apply to my property, and the whole thing reeked of intimidation. Nevertheless, I placed the letter in my filing cabinet and resolved to confirm my status with the county. If push came to shove, I intended to show proof that I was not, in fact, part of their domain. It seemed to me that Preston was overstepping, maybe hoping I wouldn't notice or that I'd cave in from fear of a legal tangle. In my head, I chalked it up to a miscommunication, until the next time we crossed paths and he showed his true nature more blatantly. A couple of days later, I was working on some yard projects, repairing a short wooden fence near the edge of my property. That fence had existed for decades, but it was in a sorry state, and I wanted to fix up a portion of it to prevent small critters from wandering in. While I was busy aligning new boards, Preston reappeared. He stood there, hands in his pockets, with an oddly smug grin. He said he was just swinging by to check on how I was adhering to the architectural guidelines. I gave him a quizzical look, reminding him that I wasn't covered by those guidelines. I then politely asked if there was anything else I could help him with. Preston paused, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "I'm the kind of person who wants to keep the neighborhood consistent. You don't want to be the odd one out, do you?" His voice was drenched with condescension. I shrugged, telling him my property was my own. I had no intention of blending in if it meant letting someone else dictate how I maintained my home. He scowled at me, but before he stomped off, he mentioned something about how every property on this stretch of river is essential to the overall values in the community. I was left with a sense of dread. The conversation felt like a carefully veiled threat. or at least a harbinger of trouble to come. I kept working on my fence, wondering if Preston would actually escalate matters, or if this was just how he got his kicks, by bossing people around. 2 months passed, and while I saw Preston from time to time, he didn't approach me directly. However, I found pamphlets wedged in my door handle every couple of weeks, all sporting the HOA's name and contact information. Some of these flyers stated that membership wasn't optional in our neighborhood. Others threatened potential fines for unapproved modifications, referencing a variety of purported infractions I'd never even heard of, like installing a new fence panel without approval or having an unregistered structure by the river. I suspected they meant my small kayak storage shed. I tried to ignore the nonsense, focusing on the reasons I'd fallen in love with the property: the relaxing environment, the freedom to remodel on my own schedule, and the satisfaction of being slightly off the beaten path. Around that time, 2 subplots emerged in my life that would strangely tie into everything later. The first was that I took on a side business of making custom wooden furniture. I'd always liked carpentry, and with my job being mostly remote, I decided to use my garage workshop to craft small tables, chairs, and decorative shelves. I sold them through an online marketplace, and word soon spread locally about my work. A few of my neighbors, ones who actually lived in the official HOA zone, came to me for custom pieces. I got to know them better, and in these conversations, a recurring theme popped up. Preston was a nightmare for many of them. They whispered stories about him dictating everything from mailbox design to how often folks needed to trim their grass. Some of them genuinely feared crossing him because he'd find obscure rules to cite and impose fees. Despite living under his rule, they asked me to build them furniture with a sense of hushed secrecy, as if they didn't want Preston to even know about those transactions. I felt sorry for them, but grateful that I didn't have to answer to that guy. The second subplot involved an old friend of mine who was an experienced property attorney. I'd gone to college with him, and though we fell out of touch for a while, we reconnected when I moved. One day, over lunch, I described the odd scenario with the HOA. He found it both hilarious and frustrating. He said he'd be more than happy to look into the county records to confirm that my property wasn't under any contracts. He told me I'd be on solid footing if the HOA ever tried to file claims or force me into compliance. The best thing I could do, he advised, was to keep documenting every attempt they made to strong-arm me. He also mentioned that sometimes HOAs will cross lines, hoping the homeowner won't contest it legally. With that knowledge, I kept a folder for every flyer, letter, and note I received from them. I hoped I'd never need to use it, but I wanted to be prepared. You'd think that would be the extent of my trouble, but things took an unexpected twist when Preston's personal life spilled into our neighborhood drama. The story began on another bright morning when he marched up my driveway uninvited and announced in a peculiar tone that he had an important proposition for me. My guard immediately shot up because everything about him felt pushy and self-important. He seemed jittery, like he couldn't wait to get his words out. He launched into a semi-rambling speech about how he was recently dealing with a difficult situation in his marriage. To my surprise, he admitted that he and his wife, Marina, had grown incompatible and were filing for divorce. According to him, they couldn't bear to live together any longer, and she needed a new place to stay temporarily while sorting out her finances. I must admit, I didn't see how this had anything to do with me, so I nodded politely, but kept my expression neutral. Preston then proceeded to tell me that my house was the most optimal property for his soon-to-be ex-wife's needs. He tried to make it sound like a compliment at first, praising my home's layout, the scenic view, how comfortable and spacious it was, and how he wanted her to still have some of the comforts from their former life. But that flattery was overshadowed by the bizarre request that followed. He asked me to open up at least one of my guest rooms for Marina to live in. Not rent, mind you, just live there as though she was entitled to it. He referred to me as the caretaker of the property, as though I was obligated to help a neighbor in need. The moment was surreal. I remember staring at him in silence for a few seconds, trying to process if this was some kind of joke. When it became clear he was dead serious, I finally found my voice and explained that I wasn't running a hotel or any kind of rental service, and that it wouldn't be appropriate or comfortable for me to allow a stranger to move into my home. A flicker of annoyance passed over Preston's face. He said something along the lines of, "Well, I think you misunderstand how things work around here. If I decide this place is a hotel, then it'll be deemed a hotel in our neighborhood records." He said it as if that statement should make total sense and I'd just roll over. I immediately responded that he had no authority whatsoever to designate my private residence as anything, particularly given that I wasn't even part of the HOA. I added that if he kept insisting on this nonsense, I'd have no choice but to call the police or get the courts involved. Preston didn't like hearing that. He attempted to guilt me by saying that since Marina had nowhere else to go, it was my moral obligation as a neighbor to help. I reminded him it wasn't my business to step in for his personal problems, especially since we weren't on friendly terms. He scoffed at my defiance, then gave me a final warning. If you keep ignoring the will of the neighborhood, we can make it official. We can label you a commercial lodging establishment, which means you'll have to comply with all sorts of regulations. That means paying fees, installing the proper fire safety systems, maybe even paying local lodging taxes. You don't want to go down that path, do you? It was so blatant an intimidation tactic that I nearly laughed out loud. Instead, I just repeated I wasn't part of the HOA, so none of that applied to me. And if he tried to cause trouble, I'd bring out my legal recourse. Preston's face turned bright red and he walked away with frustration etched on his features. True to his threat, the next day I received a piece of official-looking mail labeled Notification of Zoning and Usage Review. Inside, a letter informed me that a neighbor, unspecified, but it was obviously Preston, claimed my house was being used as a short-term rental. The letter stated that if that was the case, I'd need the appropriate licenses and building inspections to continue operating. It requested that I fill out forms proving or disproving these allegations. Enraged, I called the county office to figure out where this was coming from. Sure enough, a formal complaint had been filed, claiming that I was renting rooms on my property without authorization. That triggered an automatic review from the county. A zoning official on the phone said it was standard procedure to send out such letters whenever a complaint was filed. If I wasn't actually renting to anyone, I just had to provide evidence or a statement to that effect. Thankfully, the official sounded reasonable. They said that if no substantial evidence emerged, the case would likely be closed, but it was a headache I never asked for. I spent the next couple of weeks gathering the paperwork my property attorney friend helped me compile. We found the original deed, the official county parcel map, and a few documents that established the house was indeed separate from the HOA's jurisdiction. Then, I prepared an affidavit stating I had never used my home as a rental. Alongside that, I had statements from two of my neighbors who'd been in my house and could confirm I'd never run any kind of lodging or business from it, besides my woodworking, which took place in the garage and had no foot traffic from travelers. The zoning board eventually scheduled a visit, but after a quick look around, they didn't find any sign of a lodging operation. It was obvious I was just a private homeowner going about my life. They thanked me for my cooperation and let me know they'd be in touch about the final decision, but they didn't foresee any issues. That was a relief, but it still made me furious that I had to waste time proving my innocence against a baseless accusation. Meanwhile, I heard rumors around the neighborhood that Preston was telling everyone about my hotel. He'd apparently told some folks that I was a troublemaker or that I was running some shady enterprise down by the river. However, a lot of these neighbors already had a negative view of him, so they took his story with a grain of salt. Some even approached me directly and asked what was going on. I told them the truth, that Preston had demanded a room for his wife to stay. I had refused, and now he was trying to bully me. They all shook their heads, remarking that this was typical behavior from him. One neighbor told me that Preston's ex-wife, Marina, was actually appalled by the idea of forcibly staying in a stranger's home and had refused the arrangement herself once she learned the details. This revelation made me wonder if Preston was using the entire situation to save face or to punish her somehow. Either way, it was clear that I was just a pawn in a larger game he was playing. I tried to refocus on my life and let the officials handle the zoning case. But Preston wasn't done. He continued to fling new accusations at me through the HOA's complaint channels. One week, I was accused of harboring exotic animals. Another complaint accused me of improper disposal of yard waste, claiming I was polluting the river. Still another suggested I had built illegal expansions on my house that violated the local building codes. Each time, I'd get a notice from some local authority or department, forced to prove my innocence. And each time, the investigations found no wrongdoing. My property attorney buddy said this was a classic harassment technique. Bury the homeowner in so many complaints that they either cave in or start showing cracks in their defense. It was unbelievably tedious, but I documented everything. I started filming encounters with Preston when he came onto my property. I kept a log of every complaint and how it was resolved. I was determined not to let him win. The tension escalated to a breaking point one afternoon when I discovered that someone, almost certainly Preston, had trespassed onto my land and placed a sign near my driveway that read, "Rooms available, ask for rates." It looked like a cheap yard sale sign, but the intention was obvious: to frame me as running a rental. I immediately pulled the sign out of the ground and headed to the local police station. I filed a report for trespassing and harassment, explaining the entire situation. Because I had security cameras installed outside my home, primarily to monitor wildlife at night, I was able to provide footage of a figure who looked suspiciously like Preston stepping onto my property around midnight and hammering in the sign. Although the video was somewhat dark, the silhouette, height, and posture were a near identical match to him, right down to his distinctive way of standing with shoulders hunched. The officer I spoke with took it quite seriously. Trespassing is trespassing after all. He said they'd question Preston, especially given the ongoing pattern of harassment. A few days later, a police officer visited me again to inform me that they had spoken to Preston, who flat out denied any wrongdoing. He told them that someone must have stolen his likeness or that it was a misunderstanding. The officer seemed skeptical of his story, but it wasn't strong enough evidence for an arrest. However, the officer did say that if any new harassment occurred and we could compile more solid evidence, charges would be a real possibility. This next step emboldened me a bit, as it meant the law was aware of Preston's tactics. I made sure to keep my cameras rolling, day and night, and I even installed a couple more for better angles. I refused to be victimized silently. During this period of high tension, I got another surprising call from the zoning board. They informed me that the repeated complaints about me from the HOA's representative, which had to be Preston, were now on file, and the county was starting to suspect that this was a case of targeted harassment. The official asked me if I wanted to formally request a hearing or if I'd like to let the next official investigation proceed naturally. I told them I was more than happy to cooperate with any investigation, but I also planned to present a complaint of my own if this nonsense didn't stop. The official understood, as they'd seen similar cases where a power-hungry HOA leader went after someone living nearby. They said that if evidence kept piling up, the county might take action against the HOA for misuse of the complaint system. That was music to my ears. Meanwhile, more personal rumors about Preston began circulating in the neighborhood. I heard that he was in danger of losing his position within the HOA because of his impending divorce and his questionable leadership style. Some said he'd used HOA funds in ways that weren't properly documented, and others mentioned he tried to push for bizarre bylaws that gave the board near dictatorial control. One neighbor told me how Preston had threatened them with fines if they didn't repaint their mailbox post by a certain date. Another described how he stood on their lawn with a tape measure, scolding them about the height of their grass. The more I learned, the more I realized this was someone who relished power in all the wrong ways. A glimmer of hope emerged in the form of an unlikely ally, Preston's soon-to-be ex-wife, Marina. She actually reached out to me. She got my number from a neighbor who'd purchased furniture from me. Over the phone, she apologized for the entire fiasco, clarifying she never asked Preston to find her a room in my house. She said she already had a plan to move in temporarily with a sister in another state. She believed Preston was just using me as a scapegoat to blow off steam. She sounded genuine, even a bit embarrassed by the whole ordeal. She told me she was going to finalize the divorce papers soon, which might remove some of Preston's power if he was using marital assets or status to maintain his position in the HOA. Before hanging up, she thanked me for not giving in to him. She said more people in the neighborhood needed to stand up to his bullying. That phone call gave me renewed determination to see this through. I was tired of the intimidation, the false complaints, and the childish demands. I decided that if Preston so much as set foot on my property again without my permission, I'd call the police immediately. And that moment came sooner than expected. One early evening, as I was sitting in my living room reading, I noticed from my security monitor that a figure approached my front door. Sure enough, it was Preston again. He started pounding on the door, yelling loud enough for me to hear through the walls. He was shouting about how I'd ruined his marriage by refusing to cooperate, how he was going to bring the full wrath of the HOA down on me if I didn't fulfill my neighborly duties. In that moment, my patience ran out. I grabbed my phone, dialed the non-emergency police number, and calmly requested an officer. I explained that a man who had previously trespassed and harassed me was back, banging on my door, and I wanted him removed. Within 15 minutes, a police cruiser arrived. I could see from my window that the officer spoke with Preston on the front porch. Preston looked flustered, gesturing angrily toward my house and making all sorts of expressions. I stepped outside once it seemed safe, and the officer asked me to describe the situation. I reiterated all the prior incidents, gave the case number from my previous complaint, and mentioned the recent evidence of him trespassing to plant that fake "rooms available" sign. The officer then told Preston, in no uncertain terms, that he needed to leave the property and not return unless he had explicit permission. If he continued his behavior, he could be arrested on harassment and trespassing charges. Preston exploded at that, shouting about how I was causing trouble and ruining the neighborhood. The officer was not amused and told him to leave immediately. Preston stomped off, got in his car, and sped away. I'd hoped that would be the final straw that made Preston realize his intimidation tactics weren't going to work. And in many ways, it was. He stopped coming by personally, but he didn't stop his behind-the-scenes attacks. Over the next few weeks, I received more official complaints regarding supposed ordinance violations, again clearly initiated by Preston. The county, however, had finally had enough. They launched a broader investigation into the HOA for filing multiple unsubstantiated complaints, reviewing how the association was managing funds, and verifying whether Preston had overstepped his authority. This was more than I could have hoped for. I complied fully with the county's request for statements, providing them with a detailed list of every complaint lodged against me, as well as all the contradictory evidence showing I was in the clear. My property attorney friend helped me formalize everything. He also corresponded directly with one of the county investigators, who was starting to see the pattern of abuse. It seemed the net was closing in on Preston, and I was more than ready to see him held accountable. Word spread in the neighborhood that the HOA was under official scrutiny and that Preston might be removed from his position. People were thrilled at the prospect. Many had grown sick of him and were planning to vote him out anyway. With the impending divorce and the revelations that he'd misappropriated HOA resources to track down property deeds or mail letters to non-members, the rest of the board members were understandably eager to distance themselves from him. In a matter of weeks, the HOA board held an internal meeting, and the conclusion was that Preston had engaged in misconduct, including filing false complaints to the county and trying to expand the HOA's authority beyond its actual jurisdiction. They stripped him of his leadership role and appointed an interim boss to handle day-to-day affairs until a new election could take place. But I wasn't quite finished. The many weeks of harassment had cost me time, money, and emotional energy. My attorney friend and I discussed whether I had grounds for a civil suit against Preston or the HOA. We concluded that while the HOA as an entity might have some collective responsibility, the real culprit was Preston personally. Given the stress and expenses I incurred defending myself, I decided to file a small claims case against him for damages. My lawsuit wasn't large, but it was enough to cover legal fees and some compensation for the aggravation I'd dealt with. My attorney friend helped me draft the necessary documents. Preston was served, and instead of fighting it, he settled out of court, presumably because he realized how stacked the evidence was against him. I ended up receiving a modest sum that at least covered my attorney fees, plus a bit extra. The settlement included a clause that he wouldn't contact or harass me again. If he breached that agreement, he'd face additional penalties. That gave me an added layer of security. A new HOA leader, a polite man named Elliot, even stopped by to assure me that they wouldn't be bothering me going forward. He conceded that my property was outside their official jurisdiction. He apologized for all the trouble, and we reached a friendly understanding that if they needed something that concerned river-related matters, they'd simply come over and speak with me respectfully. I appreciated the gesture, though I joked that they'd have to build trust over time because of how things had gone. As for Preston, rumor had it that once his divorce was finalized, Marina got a fair share of their assets. The last I heard, she found a much calmer living situation far away from the drama. After everything, I came away with several lessons. First, always read the fine print when you buy property, and make sure you know exactly what your rights are. Second, document everything the moment you feel something sketchy is going on. That paper trail or digital trail is a powerful defense against unscrupulous individuals or organizations. Third, never underestimate how far someone with a little bit of power and a big ego might go to push their agenda. If you give them an inch, they'll happily take a mile, so be ready to stand your ground. And finally, It's worth seeking professional advice early on. The last time I spotted Preston was in the local grocery store shortly before he moved. We locked eyes from a distance, and he quickly turned his cart around, disappearing down another aisle. That sight gave me a small sense of closure. Knowing he no longer had any authority over me or anyone else in the neighborhood felt like a personal victory. In the end, we'd both gotten what we deserved. He lost his power, while I gained a stronger sense of security in my home. Life was back to the harmony I was seeking when I bought this place in the first place. And the sunset reflections on the river look even more beautiful now that I don't have to look over my shoulder for some HOA bully with a personal vendetta. Friends, thank you. See you soon.